There is a sentence Tucker Carlson spoke on Tuesday night that would have been literally unthinkable 18 months ago in that context. He told his audience that the President of the United States appears to have lost the capacity to manage the war he started, that the people closest to him in the White House know it, and that the conservative movement now has a decision to make about whether it is going to keep pretending otherwise. He did not soften it. He did not frame it as speculation. He presented it as a conclusion. And for the next 40 minutes, he walked his audience through the evidence as he saw it. I'm Bradford Analysis, and today we are going to examine what that means. Because what is fracturing inside the movement that put Trump back in power is not a disagreement about foreign policy. It is a crisis of legitimacy inside the coalition that has defined American conservatism for nearly a decade. And the people asking the rationality question out loud are not establishment Republicans, not never-Trumpers, not cable news pundits. They are the loudest voices of the America First coalition. And they are asking whether the architect of that coalition still understands what America First was supposed to mean. Let's start with the sequence of events, because the sequence matters. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, 900 strikes in 12 hours. The operation killed Iran's supreme leader, dozens of senior officials, and 70 civilians, including girls at a school near Bandar Abbas in the opening hours. A 45-day war followed that closed the Strait of Hormuz, displaced 3 million Iranians, and drove oil above $100 a barrel. A ceasefire was brokered on April 8th by Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. It lasted less than a week. Follow-on talks in Islamabad collapsed on April the 12th, and within 24 hours, Trump announced a naval blockade, now in effect, actively opposed by Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Australia, and condemned by the United Nations. This is the context. This is the war Trump promised would not happen. And this is the war that has fractured his political base in ways that have not yet been fully priced in by people still predicting his political future. The first visible break was Thomas Massie. The Kentucky congressman introduced a resolution in the House demanding that any continued military action against Iran require explicit congressional authorization under the War Powers Act. The resolution did not pass, but the vote was closer than anyone in Republican leadership expected. 14 Republicans joined every Democrat in voting for it. 14. That is not a margin anyone in the White House is comfortable with, and the speech Massie gave on the House floor before the vote was one of the most unusual political statements of the year. He argued that the president had lost the authority of the office because he had lost the discipline of the office. Those are not ordinary words for a Republican to say about a Republican president. Then came Marjorie Taylor Greene, and her break is the one that matters most in terms of movement signal, because Greene is not a peripheral figure. She is a base voice. She is the person who, for most of the last 5 years, has spoken for the grassroots energy that sustains Trumpism at the ground level. When she breaks with Trump on a question, it does not represent fringe dissent. It represents the possibility that the fringe has become the center. On April 10th, Greene posted a long thread on X that has now been viewed more than 40 million times. She did not call for impeachment. She did not endorse an opponent. But she did something that in the political grammar of MAGA is almost as significant. She asked whether the movement still knew what it stood for. She pointed out that the America First platform she had helped campaign on was explicitly built around ending forever wars, not starting them. She noted that the same senators and commentators who spent 2024 promising to unwind Iraq-era entanglements were now cheering a naval blockade that legal scholars across the political spectrum were calling an act of war without congressional authorization. And she ended the thread with a sentence that has since been quoted in every political newsroom in Washington. She argued that when the leader of a movement stops being accountable to the principles of that movement, but is the principles that have to be defended, not the leader. Steve Bannon has not broken with Trump publicly the way Massie and Greene have. But his podcast over the last 10 days has been saying something else. He has been focusing with increasing frequency and specificity on what he calls the neoconservative capture of the war. He has named advisors. He has named cabinet officials. He has drawn a line between what he argues is the real America First position, transactional, restrained, and skeptical of foreign intervention, and what he describes as a hijacked version of that position, now driving the Iran campaign. He has not said the president is unfit, but he has said the president is surrounded. And in the coded language of conservative media, the difference between those two statements is narrower than it looks. Carlson, as I noted at the top, went furthest. His Tuesday night broadcast was not a foreign policy critique. It was a character assessment. He said the president was operating in a fog, that his public statements were not calibrated to any coherent strategy, that the people around him were managing up rather than governing, and that the Iranian response to the blockade could produce a catastrophe that would not be survivable for the administration, or, he suggested, for the country. That last phrase deserves attention, not survivable. Carlson did not define what he meant, he let it float. And the fact that he let it float, that he let his audience fill in the possibilities, is the clearest signal yet that the most influential voice in independent conservative media considers the war to have passed a threshold beyond which ordinary political critique no longer applies. Candace Owens has been even more direct in a different register. Her coverage of the war over the past week has centered on the question of who benefits, and she has been explicit in naming what she considers the foreign policy establishment inside the administration as the faction responsible for the escalation. Dave Smith, the libertarian commentator who built a substantial audience among younger MAGA-adjacent voters, has been telling his listeners that the war represents the clearest betrayal of the America First platform in the history of the movement. Jack Posobiec, historically one of Trump's most aggressive online defenders, has posted a series of threads questioning the strategic logic of the blockade and asking, in terms he has never previously used about a Trump decision, whether the administration has thought through the second and third order consequences of what it is doing. Each of those individual voices might be dismissible in isolation. Collectively, they represent something the Trump political operation has not had to manage before. A movement within the movement. A base-level rebellion that is not being led by establishment figures, not being coordinated by donors, and not responding to the usual enforcement mechanisms of MAGA political discipline. And the dissent is not confined to media. It is moving into the legislative branch in ways that are harder to manage and harder to dismiss. The 14 House Republicans who voted for Massie's War Powers resolution included 3 members who had previously voted in lockstep with the administration on every major foreign policy question since January of last year. At least 2 Republican senators have, according to reporting from The Hill, begun quietly polling their own caucuses about appetite for a formal resolution of concern regarding the blockade. None of this is visible in the cable news cycle yet. All of it is visible to anyone paying attention to how the legislative branch actually operates in real time. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how the MAGA coalition was built, because it was never monolithic. It was built from its origins in 2015 and 2016 on a fusion of 3 distinct constituencies. First, a populist working-class realignment that was primarily economic and cultural. Second, an evangelical and socially conservative bloc that had been politically homeless since the late Bush years. And third, a faction that, for lack of a better term, can be called the restrainers, paleo-conservatives, libertarians, foreign policy skeptics, people who had spent the Iraq and Afghanistan years watching American power overextend itself in the Middle East. People who saw Trump in 2016 as the first Republican candidate in a generation who might actually end the wars. That third faction was always the most ideologically committed to an America First position that was genuinely anti-interventionist. It was also, for most of the last 8 years, the least politically visible. The populist and cultural factions generated the energy and the votes. The restrainers generated the intellectual framework, but stayed mostly quiet as long as Trump's foreign policy remained broadly consistent with their priorities. The Iran war has broken that patience because it is not a targeted strike, not a tariff fight. It is a 45-day conflict that killed a head of state, displaced 3 million people, closed the world's most important shipping corridor, and has now escalated into a naval blockade with no defined endpoint and no congressional authorization. Every promise the restrainer coalition thought they were getting in 2016 and 2024 has been inverted. Trump's response to the fracturing of his coalition has been, by his own standards, predictable. He attacked Massie directly, calling him a grandstander and threatening to support a primary challenger. He attacked Greene with a specificity that suggests the White House considered her defection the most politically damaging of the three. He posted on Truth Social that she had sold out the movement for cable news appearances, a charge that doesn't survive a 30-second review of her actual commentary over the past decade. He called Carlson a has-been. The attacks have landed differently than attacks from the Trump White House usually land. Historically, when Trump publicly turned on a figure inside his own coalition, the base followed. Social pressure was overwhelming. Polling moved. The target either apologized, was marginalized, or switched parties. That pattern has not repeated with the Iran war dissenters. Massie's polling in his district has actually strengthened since the attacks. Greene's online engagement has increased, not decreased. Carlson's audience has grown. That tells you something important. The base is not a single bloc that moves on command. The White House appears to understand this. According to reporting from multiple outlets over the last week, internal political staff have been commissioning polling specifically focused on Republican primary voters and their reactions to the Iran war. Support for the war among self-identified Trump voters has fallen from roughly 70% at the time of Operation Epic Fury in February to roughly 47% by the second week of April. Support for the Naval blockade, specifically, is lower, at 41%. And the question that has reportedly alarmed the White House political team the most is a specific follow-on question about whether respondents believe the president has a coherent strategy. The answers show a meaningful share of Trump's own base either answering no or answering that they are not sure. Not sure. That is the polling answer that kills presidencies. Because not sure is the answer voters give when they have started to have doubts but do not yet want to say them out loud. It is the leading indicator of a break that has not yet become public. Why has this specific war produced this specific fracture? The most honest answer, based on the public evidence and the pattern of dissent, is that the Iran war has combined three elements the MAGA coalition was structurally least equipped to absorb. The first is the scale. This is not a strike. It is a full-spectrum war that killed a head of state and closed the world's most important waterway. The second is the rhetoric. The April 7th post about civilization dying tonight was written on Trump's own platform in his own words. There is no ambiguity about what was said, when it was said, or what was meant. For a movement that has historically argued that media coverage of Trump is distorted or taken out of context, the April 7th post offered no such cushion. It was self-evident. And when the President of the United States writes on his own platform that an entire civilization will die tonight, the people who have spent years defending him against accusations of recklessness have nothing left to work with. The third element is strategic incoherence. Was the goal to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, to force unconditional surrender as Trump explicitly demanded on March 6th? Regime change? At different points, the administration has articulated different, and sometimes contradictory objectives. For a coalition that was promised transactional foreign policy, deals not wars, this incoherence is radioactive. Let me address the sanity question directly, because it deserves precision. The sanity question, as it is being used by figures like Carlson, Massie, and Greene, is not a clinical diagnosis. None of them is a physician. What they are describing is a pattern of behavior that they argue falls outside the range of rational political decision-making. They are not claiming the president has a specific diagnosable condition. They are claiming that his public conduct in the context of this specific war has departed from the kind of risk management the office requires. That is a different claim, and in some ways a more serious one, because it can be evaluated against the public record rather than speculated about on the basis of medical inference. The public record includes the civilization post, the shifting war aims, the collapse of the Islamabad talks on terms that American intelligence officials, according to leaked readouts, considered avoidable, the reported rejection of counsel from military advisers who recommended against the blockade. That pattern is what Carlson and Greene and Massie and Bannon, each in their own vocabulary, are calling into question. They are not diagnosing. They are observing. And they are concluding from the observation that the decision-making process at the top of the executive branch has deteriorated to a point where continued loyalty to the decisions of that process is incompatible with loyalty to the principles they say brought them into the coalition in the first place. There is a historical parallel worth naming here because it sharpens the stakes. The last time a sitting president lost the confidence of his own movement during a war was Lyndon Johnson in 1968. Johnson was not a Republican, but the dynamic is analogous. A war that had started with broad support, that escalated under conditions the administration could not control, that produced a humanitarian cost its own supporters could no longer defend, and that ultimately cost the incumbent president the ability to seek re-election. Johnson did not lose an election. He chose not to run, and he made that choice because the coalition that had supported him had fractured beyond the point of reconsolidation. I'm not predicting that Trump will not seek re-election in 2028, but the dynamic Johnson faced in 1968, the loss of confidence from within his own coalition on the specific question of whether the war was being managed rationally, is the dynamic that some restrainers are now openly suggesting may be operative in the current administration. The MAGA coalition was built on a specific claim that the political establishment in Washington had lost touch with the priorities of ordinary Americans, and that a new political coalition organized around America first principles would restore sanity, accountability, and strategic discipline to American governance. That was the claim. That was the promise. 18 months into the second Trump administration, the people who built that coalition are looking at the outcome and asking in their own terms whether the coalition has kept faith with its own founding claims. When Massie says the president has lost the discipline of the office, he is not just criticizing one man. He is asking whether the movement that produced that man is still capable of the self-correction it was founded on. When Greene says the principles have to be defended, not the leader, she's making the same argument. When Carlson says the country may not survive the trajectory, he is saying that the coalition's original promise and its current reality have diverged to a degree the coalition itself cannot sustain. That is the real story. That is what is breaking. The question of the president's mental state is the surface manifestation of a deeper question about whether the political movement that built itself around him has the internal coherence to survive the gap between what it promised and what it has produced. Nobody knows the answer yet. The coalition may reconsolidate. The dissenters may be marginalized. The war may end in a way that retrospectively justifies the administration's conduct, or the fracture may deepen and the restrainer faction may prove to be the leading edge of a broader realignment that will reshape American conservatism for a generation. What is already clear is that the terms of the argument have shifted. A year ago, criticism of Trump from inside MAGA was rare, quiet, and politically costly. Today, it is public, specific, and carries with it a claim about the basic capacity of the administration to govern. The words are on the record, the clips are being replayed, the base is watching, and somewhere in the Persian Gulf tonight, 230 oil tankers are still stranded. Iranian civilians are still living under the threat of a blockade the United Nations has condemned. And the American political coalition that was supposed to end forever wars is trying to figure out how it ended up presiding over one. Before closing, the question for today, for those who have stayed with me to the end. Carlson said Trump operates in a fog with no coherent strategy. Greene said principles must be defended, not the leader. Massie introduced a war powers resolution that 14 Republicans supported. Support for the war among Trump voters fell from 70 to 47% in 6 weeks. And the question of whether the president has a coherent strategy is producing not sure answers among his own base. What do you think is the most likely outcome of this internal fracture? Option A. The coalition reconsolidates because in moments of acute crisis, when the blockade produces a direct military confrontation, or when fuel prices generate enough domestic economic pain, crisis nationalism historically unites political movements around their leader, and the current dissenters will be marginalized or silenced by the base pressure that moment produces. Option B. The fracture deepens because the restrainer constituency dissenting now is the most ideologically committed to the anti-interventionist principles that justified their support for Trump, and once that constituency decides its principles are incompatible with the current leadership's conduct, no political discipline mechanism can reverse that conclusion. Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know how you are reading this from where you are. This has been Bradford Analysis. Share this if you think someone in your network needs this context. Subscribe so you don't miss the next analysis. This story moves faster than any analysis can keep up with. And when new developments break, Bradford Analysis will be here to walk through them with you.